So at the bottom of last week's comments underneath the video, Mary Ellen asked, didn't Jesus appear to Mary Magdalene and the other women first? And that's a great question, and that's why I want to examine and look at this week. And this raises the question of, what is a woman's word worth? And while I address that, I'm going to be making some coffee. But Flavius Josephus in the 1st century writes, "From women let no testimony be accepted because of the levity and temerity of their sex. Neither let slaves bear witness." 2 centuries later, the church father Origen had to answer charges against the church because it was founded upon the testimony of a hysterical woman. And that's the story we're going to look at this week. Prejudice against women, and especially their trustworthiness, was rampant in the patriarchal societies of the 1st century. And these prejudices continue even down to this day to a large extent. It's not hard to find various church leaders who think that Mary Magdalene and the other women were only sort of bystanders or unofficial witnesses to the resurrected Lord. The real witnesses are Peter and the disciples. In this week's video, what I want to do is take a look at John chapter 20 and Mary Magdalene's experience at the empty tomb. All of this raises the question of, what is a woman's word worth? And so today I want to look at John chapter 20 and Jesus' first post-resurrection appearances to Mary Magdalene. First off, let me introduce myself. My name's David Paris. For the past 30 years, I've been teaching graduate level theological education and doing research. Now be sure to stick around after the video's over, because I've got a link to a movie about Mary Magdalene that I think you should all know about, and also a podcast that discusses the content of that movie. Now, during the 7 weeks of Easter, from Easter until Pentecost, and yes, for those of you who don't go to a liturgical church, Easter is a season, it's not a day. The church primarily and historically has read from the Gospel of John. There's one Sunday where they don't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to back up. During Holy Week, there were some readings from John chapter 20 that concern the story of Mary Magdalene. I'm going to move that here to this week, and then that will bump the other readings out 1 week, and we'll have a complete series on the Gospel of John for Easter as a result. Prejudice against women, and especially their trustworthiness, was rampant in the ancient world, and to a certain extent it still continues even down to this day. The quote from Josephus that I read is one example. Origen had to refute arguments from those outside the church that the church was founded upon the testimony of a hysterical woman. And they're talking about this story in John chapter 20. To look at the church and see that it was established primarily and first on the testimony of a woman was utter poppycock. This made no sense to them at all, and the church needed to defend against it. Now there's 5 accounts of the resurrection in the New Testament. You've got one at the end of each gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then you have the creed in 1 Corinthians. Now the creed does not include the testimony of the woman, but as I was saying, this creed is very early and it's in a very skeletal form. It's only about 5 verses long, and it only contains 4 verbs: dead, buried, raised, appeared. When you come to the Gospels, you'll see, for example, in the Gospel of John, that John gives 2 chapters to the post-resurrection experiences. So you can see they fill out a lot more. but in particular, I'll include the fact that women were the first witnesses to the resurrection. Now, the fact that all four Gospels include the testimony of the women, and especially that Mary Magdalene was the first one, should tell us a couple things. Lets us know that this is important. All four include it, even though they probably all know the creed, because they feel it needs to be told. And also because this is probably the order it happened in. The creed just leaves it out, they include it. If you wanted to tell a story or make up a story, you would have men being the first witnesses, especially an important man. But to include a woman first, that really seems to undercut your whole argument. It's just something that wasn't done in the ancient world. It's like drinking decaf. You just don't do that. It tells us that the voice of women within the early church was highly valued. You can see this in Paul's writings and other places. And this is very countercultural. So let's take a look at John chapter 20, starting with verse 1. The story opens with Mary coming out to the tomb while it's still dark. Now this tells us two things. The first one, that it's very early in the day. And the second thing is this idea of darkness. In John's gospel, he just doesn't mention scenes. He mentions things in the scenes that are theologically significant. Nicodemus in John chapter 3 comes to see Jesus while it's dark, while it's night. In John chapter 1, verse 4, it talks about that the light comes into the world and it shines in the darkness, but the darkness is not able to understand it. So at the very start of this story, here we have Mary Magdalene, a woman broken in grief, loss, and despair, coming out to the tomb in darkness. But as a result of what she's going to encounter there at the tomb, she is going to be kicked into the light and into proclamation. The other thing that's important to mention here is in this story, John is only going to mention Mary Magdalene, Peter, and another disciple. Now this doesn't mean there weren't other people at the scene. John likes to get rid of all the extra characters and information and just focus on a few details. It's the way he tells his story. Now when Mary gets to the tomb, she finds that the gravestone has been rolled away. And so she runs back and she tells Peter and the other disciple who Jesus loved that they've taken the Lord from the tomb and we don't know where they put him. Now notice when she tells this to the Peter and the other disciple, they go running to the tomb and you have kind of this chariots of fire type race to the tomb, you know, dun, 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 dun. They'd film it in slow motion if John had the technology. Now when Peter gets there, he runs in and the other disciple follows him in. And they find the linen clothes or the burial clothes lying there and Jesus not present. Now this tells us a couple things. First off, grave robbers would not come into the tomb, undress the body, and then go running around with a naked body. The second thing it tells us here is that when they entered the empty tomb there, and they see that his body is missing and the burial clothes are there, they didn't understand. The empty tomb was not the thing that convinced the early church. It was the personal experiences of Jesus and the role of the Holy Spirit within their lives that brought them to faith. The third thing it does is intertextually within the Gospel of John, it links back to the story of Lazarus in chapter 11. When Jesus calls Lazarus out of the grave, Lazarus comes up, but he's still wearing the grave clothes, and Jesus tells them to unbind him from these things. Jesus no longer has the grave clothes on him. He is not encumbered or bound by death any longer. Now in verses 8 and 9, we get this very, very kind of confusing or contradictory statement. John tells us, then the other disciple who had reached the tomb first came in and he saw and believed. But then in verse 9 it says, for they did not yet understand the scripture that Jesus must rise from the dead. Now what does this guy believe? We don't know. He just believes the body's not there or anything because it seems like verse 9 just pulls the carpet right out from underneath him. And this is one of the things that John the Apostle loves to do in his text. He likes to place contradictory ideas next to each other. And I think he does it because he wants you to think about what's taking place there. Then verse 10 is just one of these verses that give me hope as a man. It says that, so the disciples went back to their homes And verse 11 says, "But Mary stood outside the tomb weeping." This is one of these great verses that just shows you that some guys are just gender sensitivity impaired. You can imagine Peter and the other guy coming out of the tomb. "Hey, what are you going to do today?" "I don't know. I hear that Jericho and Joppa are racing each other down at the Hippodrome. You want to go?" It's a possibility. Let's see what the other guys are doing back at the room." And they walk away and they leave Mary back there distraught, crying at the tomb. In verses 12 and 13, Mary looks in the tomb. It says that she bends down and she looks in the tomb. And when she looks in there, she sees two angels. Man, if I saw two angels in a tomb that I knew was just empty a second ago, something strange would be going on. All sorts of alarm bells would be going off in my head. But notice, Mary is very, very distraught in the story here. And so John portrays her as just kind of not even noticing that something very strange is happening here. They ask her, they say, "Woman, why are you weeping?" Now, this is the second time we've been told that Mary is weeping. This is a very emotionally laden story. You can imagine Mary, she's probably left family and friends to follow Jesus, this Messiah, this healer, this teacher that roamed the Galilean countryside. This is kind of like burning your bridges. You're associated with someone who is controversial at best. You have pinned your hopes upon him as the one who's going to usher in the kingdom of God, who's going to restore things, who's going to bring balance, who's going to bring justice back for the nation of Israel and the people of God. And then, right at the moment when you think all this is going to happen, he gets arrested, betrayed, and crucified. And even his closest disciples, Peter, James, John, and the others, abandon him at the cross. And so here you are, you've lost all of your hope, your dreams, the person that you pinned your hope upon. So it's not just the death of a friend, but there's a lot more going on here. Mary is incredibly emotionally distraught, and I hope you pick that up as you go through this story. So the angels ask her, "Why are you weeping?" And she replies, this is the second time we're going to get this, "They have taken my Lord away, and I don't know where they have put him." That she wants them to tell her where Jesus is. So let's take a look at these stage directions. We're told that Mary is bending down, looking into the tomb, and she's talking to these two angels. And then in verse 14, she stands up and she turns around, and now she's facing Jesus. But she thinks he's a gardener. Remember, she's bending down, looking in the tomb, and she's just had this conversation with these angels. And then in verse 14, she stands up and she turns around and she faces Jesus, who she thinks is a gardener. Jesus then says to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" Third time about her crying. "Who are you looking for?" We're getting a little bit more specific here. But she thinks he's a gardener, and she says to him for the third time, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you put him, and I will take him." So she's looking at Jesus. Now in the next verse, Jesus is going to talk to her, but notice when he talks to her, it says that Jesus is talking to her, and it says that she turned to Jesus. And we're not sure if she's looking off this way, or if she's looking back down in the tomb here, or what direction she's looking. But when Jesus talks to her, she turns around again. So you get this very interesting kind of staging of Mary's movements here. Now this is important, and I'll show you why. Remember, we've had her, she was looking down in the grave, then she looked at Jesus, then she's turned away, and then Jesus says to her, "Mary," while she's not looking at him. And it's this point that she exclaims, "Rabboni," or teacher. Because Mary has seen the empty tomb, she's seen the grave clothes there, she's puzzled over this, and she has actually seen Christ face to face. But she still doesn't perceive what has taken place. And then while she's not looking at him, Jesus calls her name, and that's when she recognizes. John is encoding a lot of theology into this story here. In John's gospel, people who see Jesus, the original disciples and the crowds out on the hillside, they have one experience of Jesus. The people that John is going to preach to later on, they haven't had the privilege of seeing Jesus. In his gospel, he constantly argues and brings forward examples to show you that those who actually saw Jesus in the flesh do not have a privileged position over those who believe later on. In John chapter 11, you have the teaching on the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd knows his sheep and he calls them by name. The true sheep follow the shepherd because they know his voice. You see this in John chapter 11 with the story of Lazarus and the raising of Lazarus. When Jesus goes to the grave, he calls Lazarus and Lazarus comes out of the grave. Here, the same thing is taking place. Mary has seen Jesus, she's seen the empty tomb, but it takes his calling her name before she realizes it. And this is something that the early church and that us down to this day can participate in. When we hear Christ calling our name, do we respond to that or not? That's the mark of a true disciple in John's gospel. So up until this point, you can see Mary, who is a very broken person, grieving in complete darkness, but now all of a sudden, this incredible thing happens. Jesus calls her by name and she perceives who he is. And so I love verse 17. Jesus replied, "Don't touch me, I have not ascended to my Father." Some translations translate this as "don't hold on to me" or "don't grab me," but it's really the verb hapto, which means to touch. It's this idea of stop touching me, I have to go to my Father. And you can just imagine Mary, she's been incredibly distraught. And now all of those motions are completely flipped on their head. There's got to be some wild hugging and, grabbing by the shoulder and shaking and jumping up and down taking place here. But Jesus stops this and he says, stop touching because I've got something very important to do. I have to go to my Father, but also you have something very important to do. Go to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to the Father and to your Father, to my God and your God. Jesus commissions Mary now to go and give the good news to the disciples. We now have a transformation in our relationship to God in the Gospel of John. It is Jesus' God, my God, but it is also now Mary's God, your God. It is Jesus' Father, but now it is Mary's Father. My God and your God, my Father and your Father. There is an elevation in our status as believers that takes place here. So you can imagine when Mary goes and tells the disciples this, that Jesus is going to the Father, and he told me to tell you that he's going to his God and our God. He's going to his Father and our Father. That is an incredible condensation of the gospel message that is at the heart of the Christian faith. Mary is being commissioned to evangelize the disciples. Verse 18 concludes this story beautifully. Mary went to the other disciples and she told them that I have seen the Lord, and she told them what Jesus had said to her. Two things come across. She goes and she tells. Mary is an obedient disciple. She does what Christ tells her to do. So what is a woman's word worth? Well, the fact that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all record Mary as being the first witness, and she gives the message to the disciples that's really the core of the Easter faith. In all four Gospels, the women are the primary or the first witnesses to the resurrection. Mary Magdalene in particular is mentioned in all four first. Now this synthesis does not mean that the testimony of Peter and the other disciples is diminished. Rather, it elevates the testimony of the women within the community there. It doesn't ignore the other post-resurrection experiences. It's just shedding light on perhaps the first or the primary one. Now this is not a new idea. In the early church, this was even taught perhaps a little bit more forcefully. Pope Leo the Great called Mary Magdalene the figure of the church, the model for us to follow. A century later after him, Gregory the Great referred to her as a second Eve. The first Eve brought us death. Mary Magdalene is the second Eve who brings life. In the 2nd century, Hippolytus of Rome referred to Mary Magdalene at the tomb as an apostle to the church and to the disciples. So you see, the early church really highly emphasized this and brought it across. And the key thing to realize is that they are doing this in a very patriarchal society. Now, I said at the start, if you stick around today, I want to tell you something. About a year and a half ago at the Society of Biblical Literature Conference in Denver, I got to sit in a session and meeting some people who were consultants on a film about Mary Magdalene. It's really a story about Christ, but it's told through the perspective of Mary Magdalene. And I got to see some clips and talk to the people that were involved in producing it, and it was really good. It is available on ShowTime and Apple TV, and so I've included links down below to websites where you can look at trailers for the film and also find links where you can rent it. I also have a link to Roger Ebert's review of it. He gave it a 4 out of 4 stars, and so you can read the review of that down there as well. And then finally, one of my former students, Cutter Calloway, who went on to get a degree in theology and film, and he pulled together 3 other professors who saw it over Easter weekend, and they have a roundtable discussion of it. Now, here's why I would recommend. Only listen to Cutter's podcast after you've seen the film, because there's aspects that they're going to talk about in their discussion that could be sort of spoiler alerts if you intend to watch the film. If you like this video on John chapter 20, be sure to click the little link down below to subscribe. Also hit notifications if you want to know when I put up a new video. And finally, if you really like it, hit the little share button. There's an arrow, or just let your friends know about it. Peace be with you.